Vietnam has a serious corruption problem. Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the more interesting developments that has occurred here in the past month or so. A Vietnamese real estate tycoon was sentenced to death this month in the country's biggest ever financial fraud case. This being something that is part of an intensifying anti-corruption drive in the Southeast Asian nation that is honestly a gigantic mess. And when we're talking about levels of fraud, mind you, this death sentence is something that comes after a $12.5 billion financial fraud case, and it's only the latest punishment that has been meted out by Vietnam in this Southeast Asian nation as part of Operation Blazing Furnace. The ruling against Truong My Lan, the former chairwoman of the property developer Van Tin Pot Holdings Group, follows the resignation of two presidents in just over a year in departures that were linked to separate allegations of wrongdoing. For those of you watching right now, you have to understand the sheer scale of Lan's misconduct. This is something that has completely rattled the public in a country that has long projected an image of stability. This is something that has raised severe alarms among foreign investors, which are one of the key drivers of Vietnam's booming economy. Her trial, which began this last month, played out publicly in state media, which is something that is a pretty drastic change of tactic in a country where information is usually tightly controlled. Lan, who is in her late 60s, was found guilty of bribery, violating bank regulations, and embezzlement, and from that would be sentenced to death, though her family has indicated that she will appeal the ruling. Investigators about this case say that this woman and her accomplices managed to siphon off more than 304 trillion dong, which is the currency there for Vietnam, that is the equivalent of $12.5 billion from Saigon Joint Commercial Bank, or the SCB, which she effectively would control through dozens of different proxies, despite rules that strictly limited large shareholding in lenders. And it's not just a matter of the money that she outright stole. Lan's actions would result in damages of 677 trillion Vietnamese dong, or the equivalent of $27 billion to the SCB, one of the largest privately owned commercial banks in the country, this being according to state-owned VN Express International. The scale of the fraud that we are talking about here is said to be the equivalent of about 3% of Vietnam's entire economy. Yes, that is right. This one individual right here managed to somehow steal or do damage enough to the Vietnamese economy on a scale of 3% by herself. Well, okay, technically not by herself, but she is responsible specifically for it. If we're talking about this with comparisons, by comparison, Malaysia's long-running 1MDB state fund scandal that began back in the year 2009, that is something that previously had been described as one of the world's biggest financial crimes, and that is something that involved the looting of around $4.5 billion. Now, I know that after the last video that I did on the Belt and Road Initiative, that a bunch of you went and spammed corruption in the comment section, so you can bet that we are going to be doing a dive into that. But if that is not absolutely insane, that one of the biggest corruption cases in history was blown out of the water by a factor of 3 times, then honestly, I don't know what is. And that really is why I had to talk about this first, because of just how massive of a scale we're talking about. State media would report that 84 defendants in the case would receive sentences ranging from probation for 3 years to life imprisonment. And among them are Lan's husband, Eric Chu, who is a Hong Kong businessman who was sentenced to 9 years in jail, and her niece, who received 17 years. These are just 3 people among many whose potential crimes are being brought to light, so to speak, by Operation Blazing Furnace, the heat of which has many Vietnamese bureaucrats scared for their safety. And that is what I wanted to talk about here today. Because, my friends, over the past year or so, staggering levels of embezzlement, fraud, and other forms of corruption have been revealed by Vietnam's ruling Communist Party, or the CPV, this being a part of its ongoing anti-corruption campaign, which had began back in 2016, and has resulted in the investigation of hundreds, if not thousands, of party members. Just this last month, one of its top leaders was forced to resign. At a meeting on March 20th, the CPV would announce the resignation of President Vo Van Thong for, quote, violations that left a bad mark on the reputation of the Communist Party, which is a phrase that is understood by many analysts to allude to links to corruption. This guy right here was the president of Vietnam, and although that position within Vietnam is widely considered to be ceremonial, it is still one of the top 3 positions in Vietnam's political hierarchy after the CPV's Secretary General, which is currently Nguyen Phu Trong. Stepping down after only a year in office, the party veteran Thong, who had once pledged to resolutely continue to fight against corruption, he would become the fourth member of the 18-person Politburo to resign in recent years. He would join his predecessor, Nguyen Xuan Phuc, who was forced to resign in January of 2023 after accusations of wrongdoing, as well as Deputy Prime Ministers Pham Binh Minh and Vu Duc Dam, who would leave that same month over their involvement in separate scandals relating to authorities' handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The crazy thing about Vietnam is that tight control of the media means that the specifics of their cases are very rarely ever made public. But the steady stream of departures is something that really does indicate that there is a problem within the Communist Party of Vietnam. And yet simultaneously, they are trying to send a strong message that no one is above party rules and that they are addressing things internally. Which, I mean, to be fair, does sound like a good thing, right? I mean, corruption is not a good thing, so the removal of it from a system is positive, right? Well, in most cases, yes, especially with severe fraud like in the case of Truong My Lan. But the reality of the rest of Vietnam makes this a much more complex issue. And the torch of blazing furnace is something that may both help and also, at the same time, severely hurt the nation. Now, why is that, you may wonder? Why is it that an anti-corruption drive is something that could actually potentially damage a nation? Well, to understand that, we're going to need to do a little bit of a dive into history and explain some of the background of Vietnam. So buckle up, my friends, because we're going to get into this, and it's not going to be pretty. Now, before we get back to the episode, I just wanted to talk about something that really does piss me off, and I know that right now I'm about to do an ad, but seriously, the fact that I'm getting spammed with robocalls from realtors that are trying to buy my house, and this has been going on for like a year, and I'm not the only one this has been happening to. I still have to deal with the real realtors, but thanks to today's sponsor, I no longer have to deal with the robocaller aspect.
Aura can identify data brokers that are exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Brokers are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but they always make it extremely hard to do so in the first place. That is where Aura can come in and handle everything for you, and it is incredibly nice to have. It's incredibly easy to set up. You don't have to download several different apps in order to get things like parent controls, antivirus, VPNs, password management, or literally anything else. You can just get everything at one affordable price altogether.
And so look, okay, if you want to be taken advantage of on the internet, then honestly, that is your choice. But if you want to be able to protect yourself and you want to be able to protect your family, then go ahead and click my link down in the description and try Aura today. Thank you, Aura, for sponsoring this video. And now back to the show. Over the course of its history, there have been many different dynasties that would rule over Vietnam, being in between periods of Chinese occupation or subjugation. Of those dynasties, there are four main ones that we would need to note. First off, the Li, then the Tran, the Lê, and then the Nguyen. Which I hope to God over the course of this video when I'm saying that name in here that I'm saying it correct, because that is going to be very frustrating otherwise. First off, the Li dynasty would be the one that would eventually drive out the Chinese, which would end a 1,000-long-year period of rule, and from there set up a centralized government in Hanoi. After them would come the Tran dynasty, which would repel a Mongol attack in the Red River Delta under the command of General Tran Hung Dao. And it is these two dynasties which would help build up the foundation of Vietnam itself. Now you may be wondering at this point, okay, well, why have I gone back to talk about imperial dynasties? Why am I doing any of that? That doesn't seem very relevant to the current day political issue. Well, there's a whole reason. Interesting little detail here, but the last name that we're going to be hearing a lot of in this episode, Nguyen, this is a name that is extremely common. Chances are that if you have met a Vietnamese person, there is almost a 1 in 3 chance that their last name is Nguyen. Why, you may wonder? Are they related? Well, not exactly, or at least probably not. The reason that the top 3 family names in Vietnam are so incredibly common is that people throughout history in Vietnam tended to take the family names of the emperors to show loyalty to that particular dynasty in history. And so, over the course of many generations, those family names became permanent, with the most recent one being the Nguyen dynasty. So if you wonder if a bunch of the people that we're going to be listing in today's episode are related, well, you won't easily be able to tell because a whole bunch of them have the exact same family name. Anyway, the last dynasty, the Nguyen's, the entire reason as to why I'm bringing all this up in the first place. The Nguyen's would come into power during a divisive civil conflict that would leave Vietnam fractured. Under the leadership of Emperor Gia Long, the country would reunite, and in 1802, Gia Long would construct a new feudal capital in the city of Hue in central Vietnam. It was over the course of the reign of the Nguyen emperors that French influence in Vietnam would grow under the pretext of religious reform and evangelicalism. Eventually, the French would establish control over the entirety of Vietnam, adding the central and northern regions to the rest of their conquests, being neighboring Laos and Cambodia. The last of the Nguyen emperors, Bao Dai, would formally abdicate his throne after this. As I'm sure that many of us are aware in history, this occupation would then last until a certain event would occur and France itself was occupied. After World War II had broke out and France was subsequently occupied by Germany, Japan would seize the opportunity to go and invade Vietnam. This move would result in Japanese forces taking control of Hanoi in 1940, and a year later, they would move further south, along the way awakening remaining elements of the Vietnamese resistance and spurring communists and nationalists to actually band together in order to form the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh. Over time, the Viet Minh would gradually destabilize the Japanese in the region, and by 1945, Japan would surrender to the Allied forces on the exact same day that Ho Chi Minh would declare Vietnam as an independent nation in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square. Despite that declaration of independence, Vietnam still wasn't necessarily a free nation though, and resistance to French colonial rule would then come to a head when the First Indochina War would begin in 1946. The war would last until the French were ultimately defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and after a ceasefire was signed, Vietnam would be divided at the 17th parallel. This would in turn set the stage for a war that would capture worldwide attention for many, many years. American involvement in South Vietnam had already begun well beforehand, and as the United States would commit more and more forces to the war effort, so too did northern Vietnam. Ultimately, after years and years of conflict, the Tet Offensive would mark a turning point for the North, and ultimately, American forces would retreat from Saigon as the city was taken by North Vietnamese troops on April 30th, 1975. Now, obviously, when we talk about this, we are skipping a lot of history here. I mean, a lot of history. The amount of things that I could do when talking about the Vietnam War or literally anything is immense, but it's important to understand how Vietnam came to be so that we know what is happening today. Because this is where some really messy economics comes into play. After reunification in 1975, the economy of Vietnam was, to put it mildly, not doing so hot. It was constantly being plagued by enormous difficulties in production, imbalances in supply and demand from a poorly run command economy structure, soaring inflation rates, and rising debt problems. In fact, interestingly enough, Vietnam is one of the few countries in history, or at least modern history, whose economy was arguably worse after peace in the Reconstruction period than it was during wartime. The peacetime economy of Vietnam was easily one of the poorest in the world, and it would alternate over this time period between negative growth or very slow growth. It really wasn't going anywhere. Agricultural goods, industrial production, all of this was down, way down. To put this into perspective, Vietnam's GDP in 1984 was valued at around $18.1 billion, with a per capita income estimated to be anywhere between $200 to $300 per year. So each person in the country was estimated to make, on average, about $200 to $300. As for why that would be the case, there's a number of different factors. Bureaucratic mismanagement, the elimination of private ownership, the collectivization of agriculture, all of these things are valid. And although, of course, the state was horribly corrupt, South Vietnam still at least had some entrepreneurial classes. These were largely eliminated, as the members would subsequently flee after the conquest of the North, or the ones that remained were largely put into re-education camps, all of which are factors that would go on to hurt the country. Much like China, Vietnam would go on to implement its own 5-year plans, and those would subsequently fail to live up to expectations. Really, at this point in time, nothing was working for the state. The only actual trading partners that Vietnam was capable of having were those that were affiliated with the Soviet Union. And the 80s, moving into the 90s, for anyone who is a fan of history, were not exactly kind to the Soviet bloc. China was also mostly off the table as a partner during this time due to the fact that hostilities were occurring, and so the only real option that Vietnam had to save itself was to reform itself and to open itself up to the world. And that's what it did. Back in the year 1986, Vietnam would launch a political and economic renewal campaign called Doi Moi, something that would introduce reforms to facilitate the transition from a central planned economy to a more socialist-oriented market economy. This is the thing that would create the Vietnam that we know today. Doi Moi would combine government planning with free market incentives, and from that would encourage the establishment of private businesses and foreign investment, including foreign-owned enterprise, which wasn't something that normally in a communist country you could do. Furthermore, the Vietnamese government would stress the necessity to lower birth rates when developing the economic and societal rights of the population by implementing a policy that would restrict the number of children that each household could have to 2. Which, much like China's one-child policy, this would, by virtue of that, would be called the two-child policy. It wasn't exactly a very inventive name, but still, this would cause significantly less problems than what you would see with China's one-child policy. By the late 1990s, the success of the business and agricultural reforms that had been ushered in under Doi Moi were obvious. More than 30,000 different private businesses had been created during this time, and the economy was growing at an annual rate of more than 7% each year, and the poverty level had been nearly halved. Throughout the 1990s, exports would increase by as much as 20 to 30% per year in some years. And in 1999, exports would account for a whopping 40% of GDP for Vietnam, which was actually quite impressive considering that at this time, most other economies in Asia were kind of suffering an economic crisis at that point. Things were, at this point, really looking up for Vietnam. Relations were normalized with the United States again, which in turn created a massive trading partner, bringing in huge amounts of wealth from exports. And in 2001, the ruling Communist Party of Vietnam would approve a 10-year economic plan that would enhance the role of the private sector, while still, of course, reaffirming the primacy of the state. Obviously, in a communist society, the state has to have a primary role. Growth would then rise to 6 and 7% between 2000 and 2002, this even being in the midst of a global recession that was breaking out at that time, which from that would make Vietnam the world's second fastest growing economy. Investment at this time was also massive, as it would grow threefold, and domestic savings would quintuple in this period. This would continue over the years, and by the year 2020, the average GDP per capita had risen to $3,520, which is over 10 times what it was 40 years prior. But okay, at this point, it all sounds great. A lot of you who are watching this are probably wondering, where is the corruption? What's going on? Why are we talking about the economy and growth? Well, okay, look, I'm going to be getting to that. It's important that we understand where it is that we are coming from. Because remember, even with Doi Moi occurring, we are still talking about an authoritarian communist government, something that would oversee every aspect of the economy and people's lives. The government prior to the 1986 reforms were involved in quite literally everything, and even afterwards, they would still hold a large degree of influence over society and the economy. And that, in turn, brings to mind two different phrases that I'm sure that many of you are already aware of. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. As well as, for the love of money is the root of all evil. In the case of Vietnam, both of these phrases run absolutely true. Because here's the thing, my friends. Corruption and greasing the wheels, these are things that are common in any communist country in order to make things actually happen. I know that a number of people are going to leave comments talking about corruption that occurs in capitalist countries and other mixed economies, and yes, absolutely, this does happen. But within communist countries, in order to make things actually occur within them, in order to have people do their jobs, in order for things to develop, you kind of need to grease the wheels in them. And we see this time and time again in history, and I've talked about it extensively with China. In the case of Vietnam, its newfound wealth, along with poor management combined with inadequate government salaries, all of these over time would help to create a terrible concoction from which many officials would actually need corruption in order to survive. Which is going to sound weird, so I'm going to need to explain that. Inadequate salaries may raise a few eyebrows for a number of people that are listening to this episode right now. The reality for Vietnam is that the low pay of public sector workers is something that makes them extremely vulnerable to bribery. The monthly salary for the government's top role of general secretary is something along the lines of $1,000. Mid-level officials would make around $400, and those who are entering the public sector just out of college or, just really entering it in the first place, they genuinely don't make enough to live on without accepting bribes or taking on side jobs or something else in order to be able to supplement them. For people who are just starting to work for the state, you're going to get around $150 per month. For anyone who has seen what housing prices are like when talking about stuff in the United States or China or literally any other place with major cities, you'd start to understand that someone who's making only $150 a month is more than likely not going to be able to afford to live in a city, like in the case of Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh. Mind you, the GDP per capita in Vietnam was around $4,300 in 2023. There's a whole reason why we went onto a spiel talking about the economy and development and what people are actually making, because the growth in that case is very impressive, but that still means that a government employee is on average making just over a third of that. For many of these government employees that are working in big cities, they quite literally cannot afford to live in the cities that they work without some form of bribery or other corruption that allows them to get additional income. This is very obviously not good, and the government is trying to address the issue by increasing public sector salaries by around 30% starting in July of this year, but chances are this is not going to be enough to stop entrenched corruption, with salaries starting so incredibly low, and simultaneously, there are 2.5 million bureaucrats that actually need to be funded. Corruption is a much more widespread and pervasive problem than people usually think. And this, in turn, gives rise to the concept of rent-seeking in Vietnam. Whereas the mixture of authoritarianism and capitalism that would be seen in the Asian tiger economies would give rise to developmental states over the course of the 80s and 90s in Asia, the marriage of totalitarianism and commercialism in Vietnam didn't result in that. Instead, it resulted in a rent-seeking state, which I'm going to need to go ahead and explain here. While a developmental state tries to intervene in its own economy in order to enhance its competitiveness in the region and global market, a rent-seeking state is not necessarily trying to just improve itself through unfair business practices. Instead, it is trying to extract payments from its own society in order to benefit its wealthy elite. And that is where things really start to get bad in Vietnam. When Nguyen Thanh Dung was elected as prime minister back in the year 2006, rent-seekers would effectively achieve primacy in Vietnamese leadership. Dung would pursue an economic policy that would rely on high investment and state-owned conglomerates. He would appoint cronies regardless of whether or not they were actually competent in business or management or anything else, and he would use these loyal people, these friends, family members, and others to run these major companies, turning them into money-extracting devices for those who were trying to seek rent. In early 2008, which was months ahead of when the entire global financial system just crashed that same year, Vietnam would actually fall into its own prolonged period of economic slowdown. It was during Dung's first term in power from 2006 to 2011 that several of these state-owned conglomerates would either go bankrupt or they would technically default, which caused an estimated loss of more than 10 billion US dollars, which, mind you, was about 10% of Vietnam's entire GDP over the course of a year. Dung's second term in office from 2011 to 2016 would only further be marked by rent seekers trying to continue their campaign to take control of businesses within Vietnam, and from them, the ruling class, would continue the crisis of the state and its rent-seeking problems. Out of this, there would be a growing anti-corruption drive that would be spearheaded by the Communist Party of Vietnam General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong, but that is an individual that we're going to be talking about here in just a minute. The Communist Party of Vietnam was starting to become a little bit wary here at this point. Corruption during this time was only going to get worse, and it really seemed like the Communist Party of Vietnam was specifically trying to weaken the private sector, or at least elements of it was. Because eventually, on its own, the private sector may have grown powerful enough to try and demand reforms from the party, things like asking for independent courts, private property, etc. But by implementing so many different forms of corruption, by making these varying different aspects of the private sector having to pay bribes in order to do anything, this meant that the private sector was going to be constrained by the upper echelons of the Communist Party. Individuals that from these bribes would become fabulously wealthy. Do you want to get a building permit? Pay a bribe. Need to get your exports through customs faster? Pay a bribe. Oh, did someone steal your bike and you need the police to find it? Well, guess what? Bribe the officer. At almost every single level of society within Vietnam, corruption was rampant, even to the point that doctors had to be bribed to perform procedures. Oh yeah, that's right. From one study that was done back in the year 2010 in Vietnam, 29% of the people who reported having contact with medical services in the previous year had reported that they had to pay a bribe. Offering cash directly and cash in envelopes would be the most common ways of making these informal payments in health services, and the values of those envelope payments would vary greatly between higher and lower level hospitals, as well as between rural and urban health facilities, ranging from around $2.50 to upwards of $250. It's going to sound weird when I say this, but most service providers that were surveyed actually considered the informal payments that they had to make, that those were given voluntarily. Around half of those interviewed said that they gave the money or in-kind gifts because it was the common behavior of others. And 1/3 of the patients would report that the health service providers in some way extorted payments from them in subtle ways. Patients would report giving informal payments in order to do things like help gain access to healthcare itself, or to improve the quality of the care that they were receiving, or to ensure that the supplies that were actually needed for their procedures were actually going to be available, or if they had to move elsewhere, that they could be transferred to a higher level hospital. Some of them who would bribe the healthcare workers would do so simply because the people around them already had paid bribes and they didn't want to be the person that would refuse. For these healthcare workers, though, the payments were things that they arguably needed. Overwhelmingly, these individuals would cite that the reason they accepted informal payments would because they needed to increase their low official salaries. Or, in some cases, they would do so not just for the money, but because this was the norm of what needed to be done, and this would expand social relationships, or avoid embarrassing the patients who thought that they had to bribe. So yeah, for years, government officials within Vietnam were basically selling off services in order to try and get advantages over others, or just outright do their jobs in the first place. From everything that we have described, at one point, Dung was rumored to be the richest person in Vietnam, and all of it coming from informal payments, bribes, and other things that couldn't exactly be tracked very easily. Arguably, one of the worst parts about this entire thing is that it was during this time that anyone who revealed what was going on and tried to address the problem of corruption using the media, that they were punished. The Vietnamese government's Decree No. 2, which fines journalists for vague infractions and requires them to publish sources, would go into effect on February 25th, 2011. The decree, which Prime Minister Nguyen Thanh Dung would sign on January 6th, would stipulate fines ranging from 1 million to 40 million dong, or $50 to $2,000 for journalists and newspapers that would violate the decree's overly broad and vague provisions, such as failing to abide by the requirements of the 1990 press law as had been amended in 1999 to provide, quote, honest domestic and international news in accordance with the interests of the country and the people. Journalists who crossed the vague line that was set by the government would be punished harshly. As an example, on October 15, 2008, the People's Court of Hanoi would sentence Nguyen Viet Chinh, who is a reporter for the newspaper of Thanh Ninh, to 2 years in prison, and another guy, Nguyen Van Hai, who is a reporter for the newspaper Toi Tre, to a 2-year suspended sentence for, quote, abusing democratic rights under Penal Code Article 258. Both reporters were prosecuted for their coverage of the high-profile PMU-18 corruption case, something that would involve the Transportation Ministry's mishandling of official development assistance from Japan. 4 other journalists during this time would be stripped of their press cards in connection with the case. And yeah, that is a fun one, definitely. I don't know how many good images I'm actually going to be able to get of this one, but Project Management Unit 18, or PMU-18, this was a bureau within the Vietnamese Ministry of Transportation for road construction and other infrastructure projects. As of 2006, this is an entity that had a budget of $2 billion, which included funds from overseas donors, notably Japan, the European Union, Australia, and the World Bank. In early January of 2006, a man by the name of Bui Tin Dung, who was the executive director of PMU-18, was detained. And it was announced that $1.8 million had been embezzled in order to gamble on football matches. That's right, this guy went and gambled on soccer matches. He was also accused of using the payouts to pay for adult favors, and the police would find files inside the unit's computers that would reveal over 200 other employees at the unit had also participated in the gambling. He would also be under investigation over the procurement of luxury vehicles for other government officials, and in general had stolen a lot of money for a lot of corrupt purposes. In addition to him, Deputy Transport Minister Nguyen Viet Tin, who was a former head of PMU-18, was also soon detained, and his home too was searched. The scandal would go on to affect many different high-ranking officials, and it was revealed that Bui Tin Dung had attempted to bribe officials after his arrest. People in the Prime Minister's office were investigated, and the General Secretary's son-in-law was also implicated in the scandal. It was massive. A vice chief of police was also implicated, and because of this, had to withdraw his name from the list of delegates to the National Congress. In early April of 2006, Transport Minister Dao Din Bin would resign, accepting responsibility for the embezzlement of millions of dollars of state money by his staff. This in turn would take place days before the opening of the 10th National Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam. So okay, they got him, right? It's great. Like, yes, obviously corruption is not good, but they caught him and now it's over. No, it's not. Amazingly enough, the corruption, it seems, persisted. Because in March of 2008, charges against Nguyen Viet Tin were dropped, and his Communist Party membership was later reinstated. High-level officials over the course of this event were able to get away with things while just throwing lower rankers under the bus. And for years within Vietnam, this is kind of how things would work within the upper levels of the party. This wasn't the only major whistleblowing silencing that would occur. In 2009, two other reporters from Thuy Tre by the name of Phang Quay and Vo Hong Quin, they would be suspended for 6 months for covering a corruption case involving the corruption of the Rusalka Resort Center in Nha Trang. The Rusalka story was arguably a significantly bigger corruption case. Rusalka was a large-scale tourism complex that was planned in Nha Trang, which is the capital of Can Hoa, in 2000, and the deal would go on for many years before collapsing in 2005. The scandal would involve complex financial fraud in which local businessmen and officials would be accused of bribery and embezzlement. One of these individuals was Duc Chi, who was a Vietnamese businessman with alleged connections to Russian organized crime, and he would ultimately be accused of illegal land deals and bribing local officials. The Ministry of Public Security, or MPS, would begin investigating after information was leaked to the press in early 2005. Chi would ultimately be arrested in June of 2005, and he would admit to paying $700,000 in bribes to government officials. Just after assuming office in mid-2006, Dung, who we talked about here before, he would call for the immediate prosecution and punishment of any officials at the Ministry of Planning and Investment and the People's Committee of Can Hoa Province who had helped Chi, and after a flurry of investigations, and also despite his direct orders, it seems, most of those who were implicated would actually remain in important positions afterwards. They wouldn't lose their jobs. One of these guys, Nguyen Trong Hoa, would serve as Can Hoa Director of the Department of Planning and Investment prior to being promoted to Vice Chair of the People's Committee in 2003. He was, mind you, very close to the Rusalka dealings in both positions. And yet, in 2006, he would leave the People's Committee and would become the manager of Von Phong Bay Economic Zone, the province's flagship project. Hoa would tell the Consul General that he had been handpicked by Prime Minister Dung to head the VPEZ. Pham Ban Chi, who was another provincial leader who was implicated in the Rusalka case, he would resign as a Provincial People's Committee chairman in 2003 and would then go on to head a private company that would facilitate investments also for the Van Phong Economic Zone. These two former government leaders would then be competing with each other as they would seek out investors for the VPEZ and just not have to deal with any of the aftermath of Rusalka. And everything that I have talked about here, these are just two of many different cases of corruption that would plague Vietnam during this time. As the 2000s would wear on to the 2010s, the Communist Party of Vietnam was beginning to more closely resemble just a regular oligarchic, kleptocratic, authoritarian regime, something that was devoid of any kind of ideology or any sense of a mission or anything. And that was unacceptable to Nguyen Phu Trong, the individual who would spend most of his career in the party's theoretical wing as an editor of the Communist Review. And although he was elected as the Communist Party's General Secretary in 2012, Trong was for the longest time in a rather weak position. Still though, the tables would eventually turn in 2016 when he would manage to ward off Dung's attempts to become General Secretary and would instead take power for himself. And this, my friends, is where Burning Furnace comes into play. On the 27th of January 2016, Nguyen Phu Trong would be re-elected as General Secretary by the first plenary session of the 12th Central Committee. And in his second term, he would launch an anti-corruption campaign, with the Politburo taking disciplinary action against 110 senior party members between 2017 and 2020, including 3 different Politburo members, as well as 1 former Politburo member, 10 Central Committee members, and 17 former Central Committee members. And his power would only grow during this time. On the 3rd of October 2018, following the death of President Tran Dai Quang, the Central Committee of the Communist Party would formally nominate Nguyen Phu Trong for the presidency, which was voted on in a subsequent session of the National Assembly, where the party would of course hold an overwhelming majority as a one-party communist state. What this meant was that Trong was now the 3rd person in Vietnamese history to simultaneously head the party and the state, after Ho Chi Minh had already done this from the very beginning, and another one by the name of Truong Chin. And as you can probably imagine, being the head of 2 of the highest offices in the country is a lot of power to concentrate in one person, and Trong immediately set about using this in 2018. The most important and immediate political development that would occur in 2018 was the attack on the Big Four of the rent-seeking networks. 3 decades of Doi Moi had over time given rise to a political business complex, if anyone wants to think about a military-industrial complex, something that would commercialize the state's ownership of the land, of policy, of firms, and funds for private interests. For anyone who is confused about what exactly that means, allow me to explain. Because all land within Vietnam would belong to the communist state, leaders of local government and state-owned companies would virtually be owners of the best real estate. They could do whatever it is that they wanted. They could take from one user and sell it to another because they were the ones that actually owned it, not the individual that was living there. And what they could then do after taking that land and selling it to someone else is that they were able to pocket the difference in the buying and selling prices of the land. So let's say that they bought something, or rather took something from someone and said that they sold it for $1,000, when in actuality they sold it for $1,500. This means that they were able to pocket $500 off of that land deal. Without any real effective mechanism of punishment or oversight or anything, many government officials would oftentimes favor their family members and cronies in their decisions on what they would do with land. Any kind of business person who had good connections to policymakers could easily influence policies. And these kind of political business complexes would exist at most local and even the central government agencies. But among all of them, there would be 4 particular rent-seeking networks that would dominate as major interest groups. Of course, when we were talking about this, the largest and most influential of the Big Four was obviously centered on former Prime Minister Nguyen Thanh Dung. Being the previous leader of Vietnam, he is an individual that would have a lot of authority. During his premiership, Dung would build effectively a private empire, something with 2 major wings in the industrial and financial sectors, along with multiple other tentacles that would reach out into the provinces, the police, and the military. Anything and everything that was going on in the state, he was some way involved in. One of his key allies in the industrial wing was Dinh La Thang, who was the chief executive and chairman of Petro Vietnam, the national oil and gas company from 2005 to 2011, and Minister of Transportation from 2011 to 2016. Thang would become a Politburo member at the 12th CPV Congress, but would ultimately be arrested on the 8th of December 2017, and after a very quick process was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Another individual in late November of 2018, Tran Ba Ka, who was dubbed the second prime minister under Dung for his power and role in the empire, was arrested in Laos and after this had to be extradited back to Vietnam. This is an individual who'd been under investigation for years. But the final decision to actually bring him back and prosecute him, that did not happen until the summer of 2018. From the period of 2003 to 2016, Ha was first the chief executive officer and then the chairman of the Bank of Investment and Development of Vietnam, or BIDV. As the boss of the country's largest investment bank, Ha was able to move, quite literally, billions of US dollars, and from that, he was able to determine who was going to be the winner, who was going to be the loser, who was going to be able to do any kind of business, get a loan, or receive any support within Vietnam. In one instance, with the support of the then state bank governor Nguyen Van Binh, who was the head of the party's Central Economics Department, Ha and Nguyen Duc Khanh, who was the chairman of the then largest private bank, Asia Commercial Bank, would lend billions of dollars to Trombe, whose Southern Bank was technically in default, in order to try and gain a majority of shares and then take over Sacombank. Sacombank was then chaired by Dong Van Tan, who is a close friend of the then Deputy Prime Minister Nguyen Jun Phuc. If this is sounding kind of confusing, I apologize. There is a lot of names and a lot of corruption and a lot of everything that is happening during this time. The short of it is that while Kine was jailed back in 2012, Bae would only be arrested in late July of 2017. Interestingly enough, the same Communist Party Central Inspection Committee statement that would denounce Ha in late May of 2018 would also declare that grave violations had been committed in the purchase of the private television firm AVG by the state-owned telecom giant Mobifone. What effectively these guys had done is that by inflating the value of the television firm and then arguing that national security considerations were needed, that they had to be called for a purchase of a state-owned company in order to prevent foreign ownership from taking it over, the officials would ultimately cause a loss of around 8 trillion dong, which is the equivalent of $360 million. For their responsibilities in the deal, the Minister of Information and Communication, Trong Min Tuan, would lose his seat in July of 2018, while his predecessor, Nguyen Bak Son, who is a former secretary of former President Lee Duc-ah, he would also be stripped of his former title. The two would then be arrested in February of 2019. Now, I understand that we are moving fast, I understand, but guess what? So too is the corruption. As this movement would gain momentum, the fight against corruption would launch its first major attacks on the rent-seeking groups that would exist within both the military and the police. Entities which, up until this point, were pretty much untouchable due to the fact that they had innate privileges as almost states within states. You couldn't really go after the police, as the police were the ones who were enforcing all of these rules in the first place. 5 days before Din La Tong had been detained, the military would arrest leaders of Tai Sun Company, including an individual by the name of Din Nok He, who is better known by his nickname Ut Trok, and Phung Dan Tam, who is a relative of the former Minister of Defense, Phung Quang Tan. Tai Sun was, in fact, his private company. But with Tam's help, it was able to use its name as a Ministry of Defense unit, and from that was able to actually employ and utilize the ministry's assets for its own business. Like it was able to just do whatever it wanted within the government arm of things. More than 2 weeks later, an arrest warrant would be issued against Phan Van An Vu, who is better known by his nickname of Vun Nom, who would lead the two front companies of the Ministry of Public Security's intelligence agency, Bacnam 79 and Nova Bacnam 79. Vu would then flee to Singapore, but would later be extradited to Vietnam in January of 2018. These men would then be brought to court and charged for corruption. In December of 2018, two police generals that were involved in the Vun Nam case, Tran Viet Tan and Bui Van Tan, would also be detained. Tan was the intelligence chief from 2009 to 2012 and a deputy minister of public security from 2011 to 2016, while Tan had served as deputy minister of public security from 2014 until he was dismissed in August of 2018. In yet another case, two police generals, the former head of the high-tech crime police department of Wen Tan Hoa and former chief police investigator of the Ministry of Public Security, Phan Van Vin, would be sentenced to 10 and 9 years in prison respectively for using an online gambling company as a front for the ministry's cybersecurity watchdog, and from that would collect huge amount of protection fees from it. My friends, I know that all this is bad, and we have been going on about this for a while. But at this point, when I am talking about all these things, we are only scratching the tip of the iceberg of corruption in Vietnam, and it only gets worse after 2019. This being when the COVID-19 pandemic would hit. I understand that we have talked about it many times before on this channel, as it seems that pretty much any kind of modern geopolitical issue in some way is affected by COVID. That is something that always seems to be happening. But obviously, the pandemic was not good for any nation. In a country like Vietnam, though, which was already rife with corruption, the mass infusion of government funds that were needed to supply hospitals and fight illness would very obviously experience a large amount of graft. And that is precisely what would end up happening. Fast forward some time, and Vietnam's former health minister, as well as 37 others, would end up going on trial at the beginning of 2024 for their alleged roles in producing and distributing overpriced COVID-19 test kits. The Viet A scandal, which was named for the semi-private firm that would make the kits, would allegedly see senior officials facilitate multiple million-dollar deals to supply hospitals and local communities with testing equipment, but they would do so at prices that were vastly inflated beyond what they were supposed to be. This was terrible. The country was outraged. Images on state media would show the defendants all wearing masks being escorted by uniformed police to the court building in Hanoi. And among these individuals was the former health minister, Nguyen Thanh Long, who was accused of having received bribes worth $2.25 million, and former Hanoi mayor Chu Ngoc An, who is accused of, quote, violating regulations on management of state assets. At least 100 officials and different business people would be arrested across the country in connection with this scandal, and it was just one among many, but it was very obviously a bad one. The scam was estimated to have netted some $172 million for Viet A, $34 million of which was put straight back into the pockets of officials who would take the money in the form of bribes or other things. According to state media, Viet A would say that it produced 8.7 million test kits during the pandemic, with the majority of these being sent to medical facilities across the country. But this very obviously was not enough, and at a military court in Hanoi, the company's CEO, Phan Quoc Viet, would be sentenced to 25 years in prison for abuse of power and for violating bidding regulations. The crazy part about all of this is that Vietnam was initially known worldwide for its effective measures in curbing the coronavirus pandemic. But then officials would be discovered pocketing money from COVID supplies and testing kits that we just mentioned, and also taking bribes from companies that were organizing repatriation flights. Oh yeah, back in 2023, 3 different officials were jailed for life, with dozens of others being given lengthy jail terms for bribery and corruption charges over the repatriation flights. These were flights that the state was paying for in order to try and bring back its Vietnamese nationals to, bring them home in order to protect them, but also these were very easy ways for officials to get bribed into moving the people up the list for flights, or giving them better seats, or literally anything else like that. This would come to light back in 2022, in which the country's National Assembly would remove Pham Binh Minh and Vu Duc Dam from their positions as deputy prime ministers. Minh was the foreign affairs minister who would take the lead in organizing flights to bring Vietnamese people home from overseas, while Dam was in charge of handling the COVID-19 response within the country's borders. The purge, which was led by General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong, would also at the same time bring down the president of the country, Nguyen Xuan Phuc, who would have to, quote, take political responsibility, according to a party central committee statement. Oh, that's right, my friends. The president of Vietnam was brought down by corruption charges, which I know that I obviously mentioned here earlier, but the fact that it's happening back to back to back to back to back, as you're going to see, is insane. But the guy that I'm referring to here is the one behind me here, Nguyen Xuan Phuc, which you may be a little bit confused because you're thinking, wait, hold on, wasn't Trong actually the individual that was the president of Vietnam while also simultaneously being the general secretary? And yes, he was, but he would step down, as we're going to talk about, and this guy would take charge, at least for a time, before he himself would be ousted. But wait, it gets worse. The event that I talked about before happened in 2023, and it was only this last month, in March of 2024, that Vietnam's next president would resign, and Vice President Vo Thi Anh Duan would be named as acting president. This appointment, mind you, this is actually what is hilarious. This is Duan's second stint as acting president after she had to step in when Vo Van Thuan's predecessor had resigned back in early 2023. And in announcing Duan's departure, state media would say that his violations had, quote, left a bad mark on the reputation of the Communist Party. And his resignation would come days after former chief of Quang Ngai province in central Vietnam was arrested on suspicion of corruption, with Duong having been the former party chief of that province. Seemingly, it did not matter where the state would turn. Scandal after scandal after scandal was going to rocket over the course of the years. If you, my friends, go and Google right now Vietnam corruption, you are going to drown in a plethora of results, from the most serious accusations to just the weird and mundane. And I'm going to give you an example of one that I came across here specifically while trying to do the prep work for this video. 330 chickens intended for poor families end up at official's relative. Oh yeah. The sister-in-law of a commune chairman in Guangdong province was allocated 330 chicks belonging to a poverty support project, despite her not being on the eligible list. So you have this individual that was never actually supposed to be eligible to receiving aid that somehow received aid. According to inspectors in Hip Duk district of the central province, Bin Lam commune undertook a chicken farming project to generate stable income and improve the living standards of the community in 2023. All well and good. It's important to be able to develop your community and help the people that really need it. The intended beneficiaries for the project were poor families, near poor families, families that had recently escaped poverty, ethnic minority families, people who had contributed to war revolutions, and people with disabilities. Again, all good. In line with the project, 10 families were allocated 3,300 chickens with a total investment of over $5,900 from the state budget. The organic Green Nguyen Hung Agriculture Cooperative in the district would provide the chicks and guarantee the purchase of the products for the raisers. On Thursday, Dong Nok So, the chief inspector of Hip Duk district, would announce the conclusions of an inspection of the project, which found that the commune's authorities had distributed the chicks to 10 families without surveying and informing the public. And can you guess what happened? Can you guess? All 10 households that received chickens were incorrectly targeted and did not actually meet the eligibility criteria. Among them was Nguyen Thai Hin, the sister-in-law of the commune's chairman, Nguyen Hu Son, who was allocated 330 chicks. Quote, Hin was not in the priority group, but was included in the project list, contrary to regulations, the inspectors concluded. The inspection would determine that Chairman Sun organized the project's implementation improperly without following the correct procedures and transparency. He also showed a lack of responsibility in guiding the project's implementation, leading to the allocation of chicks to the wrong beneficiaries and exceeding the approved quota of chicks. He supported his relative, knowing that she was not in the priority group and ineligible for the project. So yes, my friends, not even a matter of money, but even in a circumstance in which people are not receiving cash, they are receiving actual chickens that are necessary for them to be able to produce something, to live, have livelihood, and feed themselves, you still have corrupt officials that are stealing it. It sounds ridiculous, really, but the question is, at this point, what happens next? Has the anti-corruption efforts actually done anything? Well, yes, actually, a lot of things. But not all of it is necessarily positive, though. It's going to sound odd to a number of people who are listening because you're going to think that anti-corruption is immediately a good thing. And for many things it was. The anti-corruption campaign would yield several positive economic impacts. First, according to the 2021 Provincial Competitiveness Index survey that was conducted by the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the rate of businesses having to pay unofficial fees, or, bribes in other words, this would drop from a very significant 70% in 2006 to only 41.4% in 2021, which was the lowest level in 16 years. Mind you, when we talk about this, obviously that is not a great number, but it is still a very obvious improvement from what things were. This would indicate that the informal cost of doing business in Vietnam would decrease as a result of the campaign, making it easier for companies to be able to invest and not have to worry about paying extra fees that aren't actually accounted for. Second, hand in hand with administrative reforms, the campaign would streamline the process for business and individuals. By removing the red tape, government had improved the ease of doing business, which would attract more foreign investors, and this would foster economic growth. This, mind you, is particularly important as China's economic woes are only growing worse when you combine this with their aging population. A decent chunk of their manufacturing jobs have already left the country, and the United States has been investing heavily in Vietnam and other territories to move manufacturing to this region, where labor is arguably significantly cheaper. With Vietnam's extremely important strategic location, this makes it a very valuable partner for the United States in its rivalry with China. Furthermore, the anti-corruption campaign has broken down elements of the politics, business, what is the word that we want to use here? Entanglement? This is something that is extremely important when it comes to the property sector, which helps to actually create a more fair business environment. At the local level, many corruption cases involve just the sale of underpriced state-owned land to crony businesses, whether that is to try and make a quick buck from selling it in the first place for cheap directly to them, or in an effort to try and drive up prices specifically in order to be able to screw others over. As an example of that, back in 2022, former Binh Duong Party Secretary Tran Van Nam and former Ho Chi Minh City Deputy Party Secretary Tat Than Kang, which were both Central Committee members, they were sentenced to 7 and 6 years in prison respectively for their part in colluding with businesses to try and sell state-owned land way below market value. By limiting the influence of establishment interest groups in such case, the campaign would provide opportunities for smaller businesses to grow because larger entities wouldn't be able to just come in, bribe an official, and buy up all the land for cheap. And this, of course, is all well and good, of course. But also there is some bad. Since this video began, we have talked about quite a number of high-level officials that have been implicated in varying different corruption charges and have either been removed or resigned before they could be removed. But since the year 2016, approximately 200,000 Communist Party members in Vietnam across all levels of government have either been sacked, dismissed from the party, or jailed for corruption. Initially, this campaign was welcomed by the public and would contribute to an increased confidence in Communist Party leadership. But, as with anything that you could possibly do, when done with enough zeal, this is something that could lead to some problems. It's going to sound very odd, but one of the consequences has been a very noticeable slowdown in just pretty much anything to do with administration. This is due to the fact that public officials are becoming very anxious about being investigated for possible corruption and for shirking their responsibilities. As an example, the disbursement rate of public investment, of actually using government funds in order to do things back in 2022, this would only reach 68% of its planned target. As in, there was a whole amount of money, a whopping 32%, that just wasn't actually used. Like, it wasn't actually used for anything that it was supposed to be, nor did it really go anywhere else. And in the first quarter of 2023, more than 90% of central agencies and bodies, as well as 30% of localities, had a disbursement rate of under 5%, with 44 central agencies and bodies yet to disperse their funds. The individuals in the government who have to actually do things don't want to do anything. Not by virtue of the fact that, they don't want to just do their jobs, but the fear of potentially being drawn into anti-corruption investigations. This is something that has caused many officials to hesitate in approving anything. Any projects, any licenses, anything that has to be done, they're not doing it because they don't want it to potentially come back and bite them, which is leading to serious business disruptions. As an example, after a horrible, fatal karaoke bar fire would occur in the Binh Duong province, the Ministry of Public Security would introduce tougher fire safety regulations for all businesses. The authorities would require that all karaoke bars had to close until they could meet the new standards. But many owners would then complain that even after they had complied with these regulations, after they had fixed anything, the local fire police departments just simply failed to approve their applications. They didn't do anything. They just left them rotting, closed, which in turn drove them to bankruptcy. In Ho Chi Minh City, only 2 out of 449 registered karaoke and bar businesses would then have their applications approved, with 53 different establishments still operating. The rest would either go bankrupt or would have their businesses suspended. And the impacts of that extend way beyond just simple things like bars, karaoke, and other stuff that is fun and leisure. Many industrial manufacturers would also have to stop their operations because they would have to comply with new rules and regulations and then not actually be approved to start up again. Though the number has more than likely changed, since 2020, at least 40,000 public employees have resigned, which is a mass exodus from the bureaucracy. Not all of these are lower levels either. Among them, 89 of these officials out of around 500 staff would leave very prestigious and important positions at the government office in 2022 alone. Despite efforts to try and calm the public employees and try to increase their pay and make it so that they didn't have to be corrupt to actually survive, the problem is something that has only persisted, which in turn has weakened the bureaucracy over time. That, in turn, is only going to make the delivery of public services much more difficult. This problem goes way beyond just simple business and investments and anything else like that. In 2022 and going into early 2023, Vietnam would suffer from a very severe shortage of medical equipment and supplies, mainly due to the fact that government officials were just refusing to approve any kind of procurement contracts. They couldn't actually order any of the things, even if they had the money, because no one wanted to be accused of taking the money. Another aspect is that since October of 2022, extensive investigations into the field of vehicle inspection services, coupled with the detention of around 400 personnel and vehicle inspectors, would cause effectively the collapse of the inspection system of automotives across the entire country. This breakdown would cause delays in the inspection of hundreds of thousands of vehicles, so that they simply could not be sold or put onto the road or anything, effectively bringing the entire country to a standstill, despite, what was already out there and moving on the road. Honestly, it's really hard to classify this video at this point. The start of the video specifically arose from the actions of a corrupt billionaire who siphoned off state money through shell companies and then subsequently was sentenced to death, and it then turned into a deep dive on Vietnamese corruption as a whole. The weird thing about all this is that Truong's anti-corruption campaign may have inadvertently exposed the public to divisions among the political elite, something that is very dangerous for the Communist Party of Vietnam because traditionally it employs state propaganda to try and project an image of unity, of solidarity, of strength, especially among the Central Committee, the Politburo, Secretariat, and any other key central organizations. It's not like anything that you'd see in the United States of Republican versus Democrat or any other kind of political party that you can imagine from your respective countries that are constantly at each other's throat. Maintaining the perception of elite cohesion at the central level is crucial for regime survival, as any kind of perceived split among the different elites could galvanize dissatisfied citizens to take action against the government. And the anti-corruption campaign would very abruptly expose the reality that the Communist Party of Vietnam is not as unified as it claims to be, something that with time can severely undermine its legitimacy, even as it continuously tries to address that corruption. The big worry now, though, is can the movement actually last? Blazing Furnace is specifically the brainchild of this guy, of General Secretary Truong. Without him and his more hardline moralizing thought, without his communist moralization, there isn't really much of a movement in the first place. Nguyen Phu Trong is 80 years old at this point, and he's on his third term. On the 1st of February 2021, he would say while attending a press conference, quote, "I am not in great health. I am old and I want to rest. But the Congress has elected me, and so I will comply with my duty to serve as a party member." His advanced age and health issues make the future after him very uncertain. He is 80 years old, as I said, and he does have well-known health issues. He is unlikely to remain in power beyond 2026 when the next party congress is scheduled. If the current core leadership structure persists, the question of who is actually supposed to replace him and fix the issues after him, well, that is something that hasn't been resolved yet. The entire reason as to why this individual has so much authority is that his reputation is arguably squeaky clean, or at least he is the cleanest figure in the system as it stands. And any potential candidate who takes over afterwards is likely going to face immense difficulties in establishing the same level of authority, considering the sheer pervasiveness of corruption within Vietnam. That, in turn, could result in a succession crisis if there is no visible candidate who could actually become the next core leader. Truong attributes the decay of political ideology as being the main reason why corruption is so pervasive. As a result, during his tenure, he has taken drastic measures to try and revitalize the VCP's control over the ideological sphere. Inside the regime, party members are required to study classic texts that relate to socialism, including Truong's 800-page monograph, quote, "Some Theoretical and Practical Issues About Socialism and the Path to Socialism in Vietnam." Outside the regime, the authorities have tightened their control over the news media, over social media platforms, and civil society. And while Truong being dominant in the system is something that does help fight corruption, his overwhelming influence brings its own risks. Despite the formal delegation of power, other political leaders now usually just wait for the General Secretary's opinion before making any kind of major decisions. Ranging from economic policy to personal things, they don't want to make any kind of decision that could potentially come back and bite them because it was not approved by the big man in charge. This kind of centralization that has taken place, even though it is informal, severely slows down the decision-making process and increases the risk of making poor choices that are not thought about at the lower level. When he goes, there really is no guarantee that there is actually going to be a person with the same kind of mental and moral fortitude who can actually pick up the mantle and fight corruption. He has been the purest so far, so to speak, meaning anyone who follows may take a more lax stance towards corruption and undo a decade of work within the state. But really, at this point, only time will tell. In the meantime, the possible execution of this billionaire is only one story among many that we have and will likely come out of Vietnam. My friends, this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate it. If you could like, comment, and subscribe, that is something that definitely does help me and my videos in the algorithm, especially with how long these things take to research, write, and create. Literally anything in here helps. I appreciate all of you, and I ask that you go ahead and let me know in the comment section below what it is that we should do next. My friends, I will see you all here in the future, and look forward to the Malaysia video, because that one is going to be coming next. Goodbye, my friends. I'll see you next time.